Good afternoon, everybody. I am Rick Satcher, the Director of Commercialization for MTech. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Parsons, who is the Associate Director of Technology Commercialization in the Office of Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Economic Development at UNC Chapel Hill. She's managed a portfolio of gene therapies, biologics, small molecules, vaccines, and research tools since joining the office in 2008. She's a member of AUTUM, the Association of University Technology Managers, and LES, the Licensing Executive Society, and is a registered patent agent. And today she's going to discuss, how small companies can review and negotiate agreements with universities. She's got a lot of experience in this, and Carolina has some.
Hello.
Hi. Sridhar, can you go ahead and mute?
Let's keep this meeting quick. I have one more ongoing meeting right now. Something related to
Madison, can we mute him? There we go. Okay, thank you. So even though we're all muted, Kelly and I always encourage folks to come off mute and on camera and ask questions during the presentation. We don't want to chat at you for half an hour, so feel free to do so. You can also raise your hand or put questions in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer them or ask them as well. So with that, Kelly, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. So hello, everybody. I'll kind of give you a little bit of additional background for me, but I just wanted to second that I much prefer dialogue and back and forth. So please feel free just to unmute yourself and interject and ask a question or make a comment. I also saw from the registration list, I think there might be a few other folks from university industry contracting. So if you have different experiences or different thoughts, I would certainly love for you to share those as well. So please feel free to chime in as I go through this presentation. So as Rick so kindly introduced me, I have been in university technology transfer since 2008 and was trained as a microbiologist and immunologist prior to that. And so obviously I've had a day or two of negotiating with all different types of companies. And when Rick asked me to give this presentation, I started thinking about what I would want to tell an audience and thinking about some of the experiences that I have had in working with companies. Frankly, for a lot of larger companies who have done multiple deals with universities, a lot of the things I'm going to discuss today get taken for granted. But I'm often reminded myself when I'm interacting with a company who's never dealt with a university that some of these things are kind of new and scary or weird to companies that haven't interacted with a university before. And so I just kind of want to run through some of the factors that we're thinking about when we're trying to work with you and your startup company. So this is a slide that typically I would show students when I'm trying to teach them some of the art of negotiation. But I was thinking about how does this play into a startup and university conversation, and what should startups be thinking about. And one of the things that I always do point out to folks who are new to negotiating agreements is that it's really critical to determine early what items are really important to the other party, right? What are the things that are going to make or break the deal for them, and really try to understand what they're asking for and why. And so certainly, I'm sure that we all have our negotiation war stories, but I can think of multiple scenarios where we've received, a red line from a company on a contract, taken a look at it and frankly just kind of had a initial reaction of, oh, this is going to be horrific negotiation. We're never going to close this deal. And what were they thinking and why would they provide this response? And then when we got on the phone and walked through the changes, in some of those cases, it became abundantly clear that when we understood why they were asking for those changes, and they understood why we had put the terms in there initially, that a path forward to a clear compromise became readily available. So what I want you to take away from this webinar today is just understanding why some of these things are on the table, and understanding perhaps how you can find compromises or ways to work with the university. So I also want to highlight this point, which is to understand and determine early in the process who you're negotiating with. You know, I would say if you're working with a bigger company, sometimes this can be a little bit more of a mystery because you don't know if the person at the table is actually the one who can sign off in a term. I say this is less of a problem when dealing with the university. However, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, do understand that there are a lot of other people that are impacted and have a say in how these negotiations play out. So ultimately, the Tech Transfer Office is going to have the right to say yes or no, or to agree to a term. But for us, our inventors and our departments are intimately involved in these deals and how this moves forward. And so also understand that the person you're negotiating with is also having to represent not only the best interest of the university, but also the interest and goals of the inventors behind that particular invention. So what are the goals of university technology commercialization? So you can think about, you know, what are the driving factors behind what you're seeing? Very quickly, a big part of our mission, particularly at UNC Chapel Hill, is to utilize IP and these relationships to recruit and retain our faculty. We certainly want to strengthen our industry partnerships and attract commercial sponsorship and collaborations. We are very intimately tied into how to best facilitate and accelerate the translation of our research into products and services that actually make an impact. We are very interested in bolstering economic development. So I believe a number of you represent small companies. And for us, that is a critical area of engagement, right? We want to see your companies grow. We want to see new jobs brought to the area. And so we're very interested in collaborating with you in ways to do that. We want to reinvest revenue into research and translational efforts at UNC so that we can further our mission. And then we're going to support and engage university-wide initiatives related to research or translation or education. So overall, we want to enable and optimize the impact of the university research both internally and externally. So, you know, I never used to include this slide in my presentations, and now it's just kind of become a standard. And I'll only give you a little bit of why. So a number of years ago, I was teaching a class to some graduate students and postdocs, and there was an individual at the back of the room who I could tell was not at all pleased with what I was having to say or talking about the university's role in managing intellectual property and startup companies and licensing. And when I was done, he literally burst out of his chair and proceeded to vent about all the ills of tech transfer and how we should be disseminating all of the inventions and data that we develop here freely, and we should just be publishing them, that we shouldn't be patenting. And at that point, you know, I let him vent, talk about his concerns about the university's role in this process. And then I engaged him in conversation about what he did and what his research was. And in this particular case, he was a medicinal chemist working on compounds to treat a certain type of cancer. And when I asked him, what did he think would happen with his invention if we didn't file on it? You know, he said, oh, well, companies will develop it, right? And then we talked a lot about, you know, this gap between early stage government funding and then private sector funding. And the fact that the university really did need a mechanism for incentivizing folks like yourself to come to the table and help us take research out of the institution across the finish line, either to the market or to the clinic. So most of you may be very familiar with this, but to those of you who aren't, University Tech Transfer was effectively born in 1980 out of the Bayh-Dole Act. So before 1980, inventions developed with federal funding at universities had to be assigned back over to the government. no surprise, I don't think anybody was shocked by this, that very, very few of the patents that were being assigned back to the government were actually being developed into products. And so in 1980, when this law passed, it did allow universities and nonprofits to be able to elect to retain ownership of inventions developed under federally funded research. And then there were other provisions that come into place, some of which we will get into here momentarily and how they impact our license agreements. But under the Bayh-Dole Act, we are encouraged to collaborate with commercial entities and to certainly promote the development and validation of inventions arising from federal funding. We are expected to file patents on inventions that the university elects to own. We are to give licensing preference to small businesses when possible. The government does retain a non-exclusive license to practice the patent throughout the world. The government does retain margin rights, and we'll touch on that again here in a second. And then revenues must be shared with inventors, departments, and the tech transfer offices to support further innovation. So the reason I'm putting this slide up, this is just kind of an outline of the pre-licensing process or pathway for our office. And the reason I put it up is because I think most people feel like this is just a very standard and rote processes that inventions take through the university. You know, the inventions reported to our office, we decide whether or not to file, we're marketing, and then we're identifying a company or perhaps deciding to form a startup company, licensing it, and then we're sending it out the door. And yes, those are all certainly important parts of the pathway. But what I would say to you from a small business point of view is that there really are a lot of different places on this pathway for you to engage with universities. Certainly even prior to the report of an invention, I think universities are becoming more and more open to thinking about ways that we can be receptive to the needs of the commercial sector, right? So if there's a project that you're interested in collaborating on, or if there's a particular market need, we're really interested in engaging with companies early to think about how we can approach that, if there's a particular area of research that we need to be more aligned with, and then setting up ways that we can collaborate with you on that. Certainly after a company is formed or after a license is completed, that is definitely an ongoing relationship with those companies in order to continue to develop the IP and also to support other efforts of that company. So we're certainly interested in engaging with companies anywhere along this path. So, you know, I showed this slide just because, you know, especially kind of coming from the point of new folks who are either entering from the industry or university side, I often find that there is this notion that somehow, you know, we're all sitting around a table together, hemming and hawing or going back and forth over the terms. And this generally isn't it most of the time. I do have a few war stories that I'd be happy to share on some negotiations that looked a lot more like this. But in general, the financials are the easy part, right? I mean, for an early stage technology, you know, we might be going back and forth, but for the most part, we're going to have a pretty good grasp and be fairly attuned into what those financials should look like. And so I find that, you know, I can negotiate a term sheet for financials within the course of a business day. I would love to say that's how quickly we can negotiate a license agreement, but I think we all know that just simply isn't the case. I do think it's also important to remember as you're trying to work with the institution, that it's also ultimately in that university's best interest, as well as for your company, for you to receive investments, partnerships, and ultimately to take that product to market. So in some ways, do remember that you do have the same goal, that you're just trying to figure out how to align to protect each other's interest. So what are some of the major factors that drive university licensing terms or negotiations? So first, I would say obligations to funding agencies or co-owners. So as we just addressed, and like I said, we'll touch on this again in a minute, certainly universities and most major research institutions are going to receive a significant amount of research funding through the federal government. And obviously we're going to have to be careful to account for that, because at the end of the day, so UNC has over $1 billion in research coming in each year, the majority of which is federal. And so at the end of the day, we have to very carefully protect our ability to keep that line of funding coming into the institution. Another thing that we're going to have to think about and accommodate are obligations to co-owners. So it should be no surprise that for institutions, our inventors are going to be collaborating, right, with potentially with other academic institutions, potentially with companies like yourself, and perhaps they may be co-owners in the IP. And so we need to be obviously careful about how that's managed, not only to protect the rights of the co-owners, but also to protect those relationships. We certainly also are cognizant of the fact that we do consider ourselves to have a significant obligation to the taxpayer and to the citizen. UNC is predominantly, most of our IP is predominantly in the healthcare space. So we have a School of Medicine, we have a joint program in biomedical engineering, but we don't have a School of Engineering. And so therefore, I would say probably 85 to 90% of the inventions that we're going to handle each year are going to have some kind of impact, either as a therapeutic or some impact on healthcare. And so, over the last, I would say 5 or 6 years in particular, we're finding that we're getting more and more involved and work more and more closely with groups like patient foundations and nonprofits. And so we understand ultimately that these projects and their success or failure has a real tangible impact on certainly patients and their families. We also want to protect the university's primary mission, which, kind of coming back to that $1 billion plus research budget, we certainly have to protect that mission to conduct research, and we need to protect our ability to publish the findings of that research. And then, as I also alluded to earlier, we do need to be sure that we're sensitive to the needs and goals of our inventors. And so just kind of as a background for how inventors are treated at universities, this split as far as revenue is going to be concerned is going to be different at each institution, but you're going to find generally the same setup, right? So just like, if someone comes to work at your company, they're going to be required to assign their intellectual property to that company. The same thing is true at the institution. So inventions that are developed by our employees or students related to their academic research area are required to be assigned to the university. I think something that is often misunderstood and is important for you to remember as you're working with potentially with faculty members, or if you're doing a university startup company, is that just because a faculty member is coming over to the startup company lab to do work doesn't get around this obligation to the university. So we'll touch back on that, but I want you to be contemplating from a startup perspective that if you're going to engage with university scientists on a project, that you do need to be thinking about your IP strategy and how you plan on coordinating with the university on that going forward. And so for our office, after any expenses are recovered, any revenue is split 40, 40, 20. So 40% goes to the inventors departments, 40% goes to the inventors personally, and then 20% of the revenue stays with our office to be reinvested in our patent fund. So we do recognize the fact that university inventors share in the success of their inventions. And this does create a little bit of a different dynamic when it comes to negotiations. So, do remember that unlike a company where an employee has assigned their rights in the IP to the company, and then, perhaps there's a bonus or something else or recognition for their contribution, they're not going to be as intimately involved as a university inventor who is going to have a personal interest in the terms of the license agreement to their invention. So that is kind of a force behind the scenes to be remembered. Also, at least for North Carolina, this is not necessarily true for every state, but we do have a policy that does not allow UNC inventors to quote unquote, double dip in equity. So if there is a UNC inventor who's also a founder in the startup company, they must choose whether to receive their equity through the company or their equity through the university. Almost universally, it's in their best interest to take their equity through the startup company, but that's certainly something we have to keep in mind as well. So first of all, as far as terms are concerned, I wanted to touch on retained government rights. And I would say that 100% of the time, this is my clear indicator on whether or not a new licensee that we're talking to has ever been involved in a university negotiation before. So if they haven't, usually within a half hour of getting the contract, I'll get a phone call with a very panicked voice about, what is this government rights and requirements related to my license and the IP that I'm licensing into the company. Frankly, at least for UNC, we just include this in all of our licenses because the reality is that federal funding touches pretty much everything that we do here at the institution. So under Bayh-Dole, as I stated earlier, the government does receive a non-exclusive license, and they do have the ability to basically have margin rights on the IP. I think a couple things here, and this could probably be a webinar in and of itself, especially in this day and age, is that, the way that we've always calmed people's fears is to point out that even though the US government has this right, that they've never executed on this right. And that we've always felt that it would have to be a tremendous and unprecedented situation in order for them to act on this. Certainly that has been some of the concern around some of, the conversations ongoing around, the COVID vaccines and manufacturing, et cetera. And everyone in university research is watching that carefully because we do understand that the government's actions there will have impacts on our ability to partner and to make sure that our licensees feel secure in the rights that they've obtained from the university. I think the other thing to remember too as a licensee is that these government rights only apply to the university's patent rights. And so certainly there are situations, small molecules are kind of the nice example, where if the university has the IP to that particular compound, that chemical compound, well then, the IP is pretty cut and dry around the product. However, I would say in most cases, ultimately the company is using the university IP either as a component or a part or is building upon it for the ultimate licensed product. And in that case, certainly the government could not move in and sell the product without having the full rights. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're thinking about what your risk is relative to the federal funding. I think another major issue that can really impact a company's business plan around how to develop a licensed product is around the government obligations for manufacturing. So if we are licensing technology that has been developed utilizing federal funds, then it is a requirement that for that licensed product, if it's sold or used in the United States, that it has to be substantially manufactured in the United States. And I was actually having a conversation with the company about this yesterday because, they're looking at developing a technology for a rare disease. So in theory, we could do manufacturing in Europe in their current facility that would be at a quantity sufficient to treat all the patients, including in the US. But there was federal funding. And so, there's concern about their ability to do that. Manufacturing waivers can be obtained. And we used to have a little bit more success with this, but be warned, they are extremely difficult to obtain. And typically we're having to provide proof or at least some documentation showing that perhaps, there's one manufacturing or two manufacturing facilities that's capable of making the product, and they're sitting outside the US. And even then it can be kind of a long, arduous process. So I'd say definitely keep this in mind if you're bringing federally funded research into your company. So another issue that can cause people some heartburn if they haven't dealt with the institution before is our retained university rights. So I think, individuals who have historically worked with other companies or in-licensed a program just anticipated that the company would transfer the program over, kind of cease and desist, and their company would be the only ones moving forward. And I think do be cognizant of the fact that, kind of back to some of my points earlier, that in the day, ultimately our primary goal here is to protect our ability to do research and to publish and carry our academic mission. And so when we license IP, we will not restrict our ability to continue to conduct research in that space. We also point out to folks that, we have cases where companies said, well, this faculty member is no longer interested in this particular line of work. And that's all well and good, but that may change. And there also might be other faculty at the institution who are interested in conducting research in that same space. And so, we certainly can't obligate other faculty who aren't even involved in the transaction not to be able to move forward in the future. We also must be able to maintain the ability to collaborate with others and share resources. So we're required under a lot of our federal funding to share research tools. And we also want to be able to conduct research both with other institutions and with companies, so long as, we obviously will not grant commercial rights to the licensed IP to another third party. And we must be able to publish without licensee interference. So something that I've certainly seen come through a few times is this request for the company to be able to review and modify publications. And that's frankly just a hard stop. For multiple reasons, including conflict of interest. We can't have the appearance that a licensee of IP is manipulating or adjusting publications related to the technology. Also, do keep in mind that the university and university faculty do have a kind of growing obligations, frankly, regarding conflict of interest requirements and disclosures. And so if you are licensing IP from a university, please be cognizant of the fact that the faculty involved will likely have to disclose the IP and their relationship with your company related to any of their publications or presentations. Any questions? So the next thing that I want to bring up is another point of, I think, a strong point of anxiety for licensees, and I would say across the board, right? And that's around due diligence milestones. So for universities, our biggest fear is that a company is going to license technology and then effectively shelve it, right? So for a university, the reason for us to license is to enable the development and translation, ultimately the commercialization of a program. Certainly, we understand that from a business point of view, it might strategically be appealing to you to bring a technology into the company solely for your ability to control whether or not it's developed, right? And that you may just want to be able to keep other people from acting. And that might be a relationship you can form with another company. But for a university, once again, that's a hard stop. We need to be assured that you're licensing the program because you actually have an intention of developing that program. And so part of the way that we handle this is by including what's referred to as due diligence milestones in the license agreement. So here's an example I've put here, and this one is actually a little bit more complex than normal. I just wanted to kind of give you an example of one that we kind of had to figure out a little bit how to approach. So in this particular case, we had a startup company who came to us. They had some potential partners at the table, and they had a new antibody technology. And there were a couple ways that that could be applied. There was some interest and thought around collaborations on the ability to use the antibody as a reagent and to provide services for other companies. And then there was also potential to use this particular antibody technology for developing therapeutics. But the company was unclear about which direction that the investment and the partnerships were going to go. And so what we decided was that we would actually lay out due diligence milestones for each business plan. And so they could either accomplish both, or they would ultimately pick one, and then the other license field would come back to the institution. So as we're working with the company, as the university is kind of thinking about it and thinking about what you're asking to license, if they're asking questions about kind of what your development plan is, what kind of product you're thinking about making, it's probably in part because they want to think about how these due diligence milestones could be structured to fit within your business plan and to make sure that a product's being developed. These due diligence milestones are typically hard deadlines, but I will say this, I think once again, it causes companies a lot of distress when they say, oh my gosh, okay, if I can't get this thing to IND by this date, I'm going to lose my license. And we all know that there's always twists and turns, especially in clinical development. Keep in mind that it is certainly not generally in the university's best interest to have licensees terminate. We spend a lot of time developing that relationship. The company spends a lot of time developing the product. And so for us, this is generally a tool for us. If a company comes back, they stay in communications with the university, they come back to us and say, look, we hit this snag in manufacturing, we're having a problem, we're having to redesign the therapy, or we've received this data and now we're on clinical hold until we can collect X, Y, and Z. Universities typically are going to want to work with you to keep that program moving forward as long as you're communicating clearly as to the obstacles that you're hitting in order to develop the product. I think the other,
sorry to interrupt, do
Yep.
you require, or do universities require reports or annual reports on licenses that they acquire?
Yes, so we do require annual reporting. That reporting is different for a startup company versus a large, like let's say large pharma. So if it was a license to a very large company, we're just going to be looking for updates on the particular program. If we're licensing a program into a startup company, we're going to also require that we get updates on, the status of the companies, new employees, new funding, et cetera, because we want to make sure that the company is actually moving forward and growing in a way that it can continue to support development of the program. So yes, absolutely, we want to see annual reports. I do tell people, and I think this is, I find that so many things that come into play when it comes to negotiation are just generally good rules of thumb in life. So, whether it's negotiating, right, understanding what the other party wants, that works equally as well with your spouse as it does with your licensing partner. I think the other thing there is communication. So I tell startup companies on a regular basis, if you disappear into a black hole and you show up 4 years from now, you haven't met your milestones, you're past due on payments, the conversation probably isn't going to go very well. If you take the license, and then as twists and turns come, you're communicating with the university and we kind of know what's going on, and we're trying to help as best we can to support you or get you access to resources. Then 4 years from now, when things are still bumpy, well, then the university is going to be much more likely to continue to work with you and figure out ways to move the program forward. So I would also just strongly advocate for a strong line of communication between your startup company and your university licensee, because that'll serve you quite well when it comes to trying to dodge some of the issues or hurdles that you might hit in moving a company forward. The other thing that we often do put into license agreements and can often be a point of back and forth is something that's typically referred to as mandatory sublicensing. So the issue here is, let's say you have a platform technology that could be applied to a number of different therapeutic areas. Typically what we'll give is like a 2 or 3 year runway. And then after that, if there's a company that approaches the university or approaches you interested in a sub-license for that technology for an indication for which the company is not working in that area, we do require the company to enter into sub-license negotiations with the other party. And that really comes back to the university's desire to see our technologies utilized as broadly as possible to make impact. We also, think about the kind of thing you're licensing and how this might play in. So certainly in a license field is going to be another area of perhaps a lot of back and forth. There's plenty of our licenses that are just, all fields included. But another example that we have right now is a technology for regulating expression for viral-based gene therapies. This particular regulator has to actually be tailored to each product. So it's not just plug and play. There has to be some amount of development and validation for each indication. And so in that case, the company showed up and said, look, we want to license this technology. We said, okay, well, we're asking that companies only take indication specific licenses because it does require so much development to be plugged into each therapy. And the company came back with a list of 25 indications. And so, we got on the phone and I had a very blunt conversation with them and said, look, are you actually developing 25 indications, or are you just trying to lay a blanket over the space? And they hemmed and hawed until I said, well, okay, we're going to put in due diligence milestones for each indication. And then magically we now are at 3. So just like I said, just be cognizant of the fact that the university is ultimately going to be concerned about making sure that technologies are utilized as broadly as reasonably possible. So another issue that can be difficult, and I think there are various options, is around something that we refer to as licensed product data. And so let me back up and explain what I mean by this. If a company licenses a technology from the university, so let's start off with something more simplistic in theory, like a small molecule. The company takes it, files the IND, and we had this scenario play out. Company completed a phase 1, the phase 1 data was good, and then the company was acquired and decided to completely, pivot their direction, and they dropped the program. Well, they didn't drop the program because it didn't work, and it was just merely a business decision about direction. And so in that particular case, fortunately, the university had a clause in the license that said if the company terminated the license, that they had to provide all of the licensed product data back to the university. And so in that situation, the company literally sent a truck with all the clinical trial data to the university, and then we were able to reapproach other partners about picking it up and taking it to a phase 2. We do understand that can be more complex, and some of the other options that I've seen executed are, I do a lot of gene therapy work, and in that space, often we're having to take a lot of different tools and integrate them for a single therapeutic, right? So there's a particular viral vector that might be a proprietary capsid. There may be a proprietary promoter. Then, maybe what's licensed from the university is particularly the gene sequence that's being delivered via the gene therapy. And so universities are cognizant of the fact that, that the licensed product data may include not only data for the university's technology, but for other technologies. And so in that case, one compromise that we've worked out is that, effectively the licensee will work with us to sub-license that package to another licensee if we can identify, someone who's willing to move forward in the market. And that way that they can, hopefully retrieve their investment with some gain for the company, as well as the university being able to see that move forward. So that's an area where we do we are happy to have a lot of engagement with the company on what makes sense, from the understanding that we just want to be sure that if a company pivots, that it's not because, if we receive, obviously, data that the program is toxic, I think we're all going to agree to drop the program. But that if the company is pivoting clearly just for a business reason, that we can ensure that, we can still move that technology forward. I will throw out too as well, I'm working with 2 companies right now that I can think of where they have decided that they want to pivot. And so they've actually reached out to us as the original licensees or licensors of those technologies to say, will you help us identify a sub-licensee? And frankly, that's in the best interest of the university as well as in the company. So keep in mind that, the universities are here really to be a partner with you in trying to move these things forward, and that, the tech transfer offices are really happy to engage if we can think about creative ways to keep things moving forward. So another common issue is around how patent prosecution is handled for licensed IP from a university. So, there are a few rare scenarios, but typically universities do not assign their IP to a third party. When we give you a license, we are just giving you a license to practice under those patent rights. And therefore, the patent filings and the prosecution do remain with the university's IP counsel. That being said, universities are also very, very good, and their attorneys that they work with are very good at partnering with the companies. And so from our perspective, particularly as programs progress and things evolve, we're very interested in collaborating with the company because we ultimately, it's to our best interest and the company's best interest to make sure that the IP actually covers the licensed product. So even though the universities do maintain ultimate control over prosecution, that is certainly not an indication that the universities don't want to be interacting with you quite a bit on next steps and moving forward. I would say that in a lot of different cases, we work very closely with the licensees council to coordinate efforts, but we do have to be careful. So I have been in a scenario where we started to see some very strange suggestions put forward by licensees council in regard to IP prosecution. It came to our attention later that the company actually had a strategic plan to try to figure out how to undermine the university IP so that it wouldn't issue. Because they really didn't want to have a license. And so that's part of the reason we keep our IP in-house, is that we ultimately want to make sure that the university's best interest is protected, but we're more than happy to coordinate with our licensees. So the other thing that's really important too is also thinking about planning for future IP. If you were to come to UNC and perhaps take university IP out into a startup company, one of the conversations that I'm going to have with you is, what are your plans or intentions for continuing to build IP or kind of next steps for the technology for the company? And there are different mechanisms to do that, right? Certainly if the company has the money and funding to do so, then the company can hire its own scientists and then, build on IP is then owned by the company. I would say that more common than not, especially for very small companies, is that a lot of that work is going to be sponsored back into the institution. In that case, the university would own the IP that's created under that sponsored research, but our sponsored research agreement would include terms that would give that company an exclusive option to take a license. And so typically, if it's very close or add-on, then we're going to roll that into the existing license if it's created. Something that is typically not granted is access to improvements in the license itself. I think that was something that was typically done more frequently, I would say a decade ago. And, we really saw that was fairly complicated. So now we don't grant that upfront, but certainly if improvements come available, we're happy to talk to any licensee about that. Any company can license research tools from the institution. So if there's, a mouse model, cell line or something like that that you would like access to conduct research in the company, those are fairly low strings attached, fairly low fee licenses that you can get access to. And there are multiple ways that you can engage with universities. typically not as common, but universities do conduct service agreements. This would be a case where perhaps, the company sends samples to the university and the university conducts, some kind of test and then sends the raw data back to the company. In that case, it's more of a fee for service type of arrangement. Most of our faculty are not particularly interested in those type of engagements, but we have done them, particularly during the pandemic, as we've helped folks evaluate, vaccines and other potential therapeutics. So obviously sponsored research, and then certainly the university does engage with companies to help them run clinical trials here at UNC Health. The other thing I guess I will say, and for those of you in the audience who are in the kind of in the industry relations or contract side, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But historically we used to license or include kind of a general know-how statement in our licenses. And frankly, we found that it was often a point of confusion or contention because know-how was just too vague. So currently, if there's particular data that a company wants as a part of its license, or if there's particular information or protocols, then we ask for that to be specifically addressed and listed in the license agreement, so that hopefully we can make sure that there's no lack of communication or understanding as far as what the company expects to get as part of their license to the IP. And then I certainly want to address whether or not your company can hire a university scientist as a consultant. And my answer to that is it depends. I've included some links in here, and Rick, certainly I'll send them to you. I think you already have them. You can share these slides with folks. But we do have online resources. Frankly, if our employees want to participate or act as a consultant to a company, they have to submit something called an external professional activity for pay. And if that particular outside role is really very similar to the research that they're doing at the university, it likely will not be approved. But we certainly do this quite a bit for scientists who are working as founders for companies, and they're helping to, do pitches or advise in the general field, et cetera. So I would say if this is something that's of interest to you, then you should have conversations with that particular institution and the scientist. So very quickly, I do want to introduce you to something at UNC called our Carolina Express License Agreement. So in 2009, our office decided to launch a standard, completely non-negotiable license that was exclusively available to early stage UNC startup companies. At the time, we got a lot of not so happy press from some of the other tech transfer offices, but it's now being more widely adopted as we're realizing how successful it's been. So in short, what we've done is we've worked with local attorneys, a lot of the corporate attorneys that serve most of the startups in the area, as well as investors, to come together and negotiate, basically pre-negotiate a startup license that both the attorneys and the local investors were willing to encourage their clients to sign. It's only available if the company is willing to sign it without any modifications whatsoever. Startups are not required to use it, but I would say that almost 100%, I mean, I could probably count on one hand the number of companies since 2009 who have chosen to use a different model. So it's been utilized by over 70 companies, 50 of which are still active. And so we do feel that it's succeeded in meeting the original goals of our Express license, which was to really foster the entrepreneurial culture of our faculty. We wanted to make sure that we promoted transparency between the faculty. So there was, kind of long ago, some disgruntlement of, well, did faculty X down the hallway get a better deal than me for their startup? And so we really wanted to kind of level the playing field and make sure that everybody knew they were getting the same deal. We wanted to be able to expedite the licensing process, right? Nobody wants to spend, 6 to 9 months just trying to get the license to start the company. And what we certainly didn't want to see happen was having startup companies spend the very little bit amount of money they had paying attorneys to negotiate with us, right? We really wanted to see companies using those resources to actually develop and validate a product. And we also wanted certainly to make our startups attractive for investment and for partnership. So the Carolina Express is generally available if there's a business plan that's been reviewed and approved by our office. All the IP rights have to be owned by UNC or at least the other owning parties have to also agree to the terms of our CELA. It has to be signed without any modification. And there are situations where it's not available. So there are, thankfully are a growing number of programs within the institution to fund translational efforts. And so in those cases, we may ask for the financials to look a little different. And so, certainly you can look at these more closely later, but for the way this is set up is for a 1% exit fee that converts to 5% equity upon $2 million in investment. And then there's royalty is dependent upon the product type. And then, for patent cost reimbursement, which is a big deal for our companies, we do allow 1-year grace period to reimburse UNC for provisional costs, PCT, or US national stage patent expenses. We also do obtain preemptive rights under this license. So the university is certainly growing its ability to invest in its startups. And so we want to be able to maintain our equity position as well. So that is it for my slides. I'm certainly happy to address any of your questions now, or if you think of something later, please feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I love the CELA, by the way, and I know it's it resonates very well with a lot of folks. But I was curious about like the fields of use.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any restriction on that with the CELA? Like, how do you, if you're not changing any terms, what do you? You talked earlier about one licensee wanting to develop it in 25 areas, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I will say there are, we say that the CELA is non-negotiable, right? Which it isn't as far as terms are concerned, but there are 3 things in that agreement that are basically a blank that we have to work with the company to fill in, right? One is territory. I would say 99.9% of the time, the license is going to be worldwide. But we have had instances where companies, we had a Chinese company that just wanted to license in China, right? So, we'll certainly explore any of those options. The other, to your point, is going to be license field. I would say the majority of the time, it's an all-inclusive. But if there are cases where clearly something needs to be licensed in an indication-specific manner, or for, let's say, a company who clearly wants to be a service company, and that technology also has applications for, development as a therapeutic or something else. Well, in that case, we may limit the license to, the provision of services, as defined in the agreement. And then the third is going to be the due diligence milestones. So we're going to work with the company to figure out, what the timeline looks like there. I would say too that when you, and I think this is the case for most institutions, when companies are working with you on due diligence milestones, I would actually say more often than not, I reach back to them and extend the due diligence milestones, right? Because, in some ways they reach out to me and they think they're trying to impress me by saying, oh, we're going to get this to IND in 8 months.
Yeah.
Right.
Good luck.
Yeah. And I come back and I say, all right, well, guys, this actually is a little concerning, because if you really think you're going to do this, I'm concerned about your knowledge about what it takes to make that happen. Right. And let's, and there are cases where, frankly, we've used that as a red flag, because we got due diligence milestones proposed to us that were so ridiculously short, that we basically pushed back and said, look, we're not against you starting a company, but you need some expertise at the table, right, before we launch, because right now you're way in over your head. So we have had those conversations, but typically what happens is they're trying to please, and they throw me out dates that are just a little aggressive. And I said, look, let's give ourselves a little bit of cushion here. So the universities aren't trying to choke people. They just want to have a means to make sure things are progressing.
And Jill, I saw you popped on, so please feel free to. Jill is our COO of MTech for everyone's knowledge.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Hey, Kelly,
Hey,
great
Jill.
presentation. Thank you. Thanks for being here with us. You had mentioned early on Kickstart, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit more information with us about Kickstart.
Yeah, so there's an arm of our office called Kickstart Venture Services. And so, effectively what we've been trying to grow over the years is an ability to really help our startups be set up for success. And so they are a resource for UNC startup companies. Basically, think about the different things you would need, and we have mechanisms to plug in. So whether that be, you need support for putting together an SBIR, STTR proposal. Kickstart does work with consultants who help draft those applications. If you need accelerator space for the company, we do have an on-campus small accelerator. And then we, try to partner and coordinate with groups like Biolabs and Launch Labs to try to help companies identify space if that's something that's of issue. We also try to provide education, especially for a lot of our grad students and postdocs who are looking to kind of take an entrepreneurial angle. And frankly, for us, that's an area where we get really excited, right? There's a lot of faculty who they love being academic faculty, and that's great. We need them, right? But they may have a postdoc who's always dreamed of starting a company and is really eager to take the technology they're working on out into a company. And so, we try to provide them with, educational support, helping them think about how to pitch, right? How do you pitch to an investor, making connections with investors or partners. So, any of those areas where a startup company is kind of looking for either expertise or connections, we're going to be coordinating with Kickstart to help folks do that.
Does Kickstart help you with your own license negotiations or portfolio management for the startups, or are they really just more of the resource provider?
They're more the resource. So our team handles all of the negotiations with startups. And so, frankly, we don't, there's not exactly a clean line. So for certainly market sectors that are closer to expertise, like I said, I've been in the gene therapy space for about 14 years now. So some of our gene therapy companies, I get a little deeper into the process of helping some of our companies identify partners or think about business strategy, et cetera. So the nice thing is that we're all just kind of happy to coordinate and provide support as needed.
I'm curious about one other thing. Mm-hmm. I've been in the space for a while, but how big is your portfolio, right? UNC is what, 170 years old, back to the years, and the program is 40 years old or more. So how many disclosures do you all see a year?
So I always put a disclaimer on this number, and I'll tell you why. Right now, we're seeing somewhere in the order of 160 to 170 a year. I would say that a lot of folks want to see that number grow higher. My response to that is that, and different universities have different approaches. Some institutions will not talk to an inventor until they disclose an invention to the office. Our office is very focused on trying to be to provide customer service, to build relationships with our scientists, to build relationships with our companies, and to kind of be a go-to for navigating even other offices within the institution. So from my perspective, nobody likes paperwork, right? And so I do this, and I encourage the rest of our staff to do this. Go talk with the faculty member. If they have an idea they're interested in kind of thinking about, go chat with them. And if the answer is not yet, well, then don't make them fill out an invention disclosure. Or if it's like, no, you've already disclosed this, don't make them fill out an invention disclosure. Nobody wants to go through a bunch of paperwork to then be told no. So typically our approach is that if it comes time that it's ready to move forward, we'll ask them to go into the system and put one in. But I would say our numbers look a little smaller than they are, just because we try not to be regimented on that.
Yeah, thank you. We're up against the hour.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we're at the top of the hour. Kelly, I don't know if you want to stay on for a couple extra minutes.
I'm happy to, if anybody wants to stick around. Yeah.
Questions, but if you mind, if you give me control of the screen, I just want to make a couple quick announcements, and then we can invite anybody to ask some further questions. This is what I always show at the end of our webinars, what is coming up next for us. We've got an MCOR showcase featuring Curia. This is formerly Albany Molecular Labs, and they're an MCOR partner now. They've got expertise in R&D, discovery, drug substance and product development, and drug substance and drug product manufacturing. So Barbara Sulla will be giving an overview of that. And then in later February, the 23rd, Rick Starr is the CEO of the National Association of Veterans Research and Education Foundation, will give an overview. They support Veterans Affairs research, partner with the VA for over 25 years to streamline clinical trials and provide veterans with innovative, groundbreaking care and incentivizing clinical research for veterans. So I think it'd be really interesting for our members to learn about them. So we thank you again, Kelly, and look forward to, to working with you in the future. If anybody has any questions, I see a chat popped up. You're welcome to come off video and off mute and ask away. You've stunned them, Kelly. I've got one question for you.
Yeah.
On the express license deal, if a company is interested, and I don't know how often this is the case, but in a non-exclusive license, is that something that can be done through the express license as well? Or how often do people request even non-exclusive license anymore? I mean,
it's pretty rare. I would say that typically it's more of a situation where we're coming back saying we're only willing to license something non-exclusively,
like a platform.
Like a platform, or obviously, Rick, we've had this conversation in some other contexts. I think that there's a push now for whether that be gene therapy or cell therapy, other technologies where there's a lot of different pieces and parts that ultimately need to be put together for a product. There's a lot of conversation going on across the entire tech transfer field right now about how to responsibly license these technologies, right? And this is not easy, right? We recognize this is difficult because, my pushback on that in some regards is, well, if the technology truly still needs to be developed, then it's very difficult for me to ask a company to take a non-exclusive, develop it,
Right.
and then for us to be able to kind of share as we wish with other parties. But certainly to the extent that a technology is enabled and it's more plug and play, and it's, let's say around manufacturing or something that's not necessarily product specific,
Right.
then, I think universities are trying to be more responsible in making sure that there's access to that, right? And, certainly we see our interactions with companies, especially startup companies, as ultimately exceedingly critical for enabling some of these technologies that are frankly in their infancy at the university. So we want to respect that, but also, think about, how do we make sure that we don't end up in situations where, something's just not moving forward because it's kind of tied in knots. And so that, it can be challenging. So I guess to answer your original question, typically we're not doing Carolina Express licenses for non-exclusives. If somebody came back and said we want one, I mean, it's not, we wouldn't give it to them. But typically the structure would look different and probably would use a different format.
Yeah. And are you, I think you said in your presentation, the express license is limited to startups. I mean, have you worked with mids and larges that want to use the express license as well? I mean, it does smooth out negotiations, right? But
let's put it this way. Part of the reason that we were frankly kind of hated for it initially, a lot of other universities have adopted it, but I would say we got a lot of hate mail when we first launched the express license from other institutions. And part of that is because frankly, the financials are really generous, really generous. And so I tell a lot of people, I'm like, look, don't complain about the financials relative to the other licenses, it's free. Given that, certainly early on, I had a few other companies who, when we, it's like, okay, well, send us a term sheet, and they would send me the Carolina Express. And my response to that was, I'm not even going to respond, start over. So no, it has to be a UNC startup company to qualify, and we will not entertain those terms for a non-UNC startup license.
Okay. Very good. All right, well, last chance with any questions? Otherwise, I think we're all free to go.
All right. Well, I'm not hard to
Thank you.
find if somebody has a question later, so.
Yeah, we, as always, we'll share the presentation and the recording on the members only website. So thank you for your time, Kelly. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.